Our text today is out of the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. I hope you have your Bibles with you because we're going to skip around in this first chapter. We're going to read verse 1, 3, 5, 6, 16, and 17. And I'm skipping the other verses because I can't pronounce all those names, okay? I got these down, but I'm joking. I'm going to, saving time, I want to read just these verses this morning. 1, 3, 5, 6, 16, and 17. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Verse 3. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Verse 5. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed begot Jesse. Verse 6. And Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her, who had been the wife of Uriah. Now skipping to 16. And Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the captivity in Babylon are 14 generations. And from the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. You know, Wade mentioned in our call to worship the Gospel of Luke, and I'm glad he did because it's a good comparison with Matthew, because Matthew begins his Gospel in a very unusual way. For example, Luke takes us right there in chapter 2. It's one of the most often used Gospels during the month of the weeks of Advent, because Luke takes us right into the scene just really fast. We get right to the Advent and the manger and the stars and the wise men. But Matthew's different. Matthew starts by taking us back to ancient times, and he provides this really kind of tedious ancestry of Jesus. It's like a small version of the book of Numbers. Have you ever read through Numbers? I mean, the begats are just numerous, one right after the other, as the tribes are named and all the different clans, and on it goes. And as you read through those begats, you have this tendency, I mean, I do, to kind of want to scan forward, to move past the begats, because there is this anticipation that there's something going to happen sooner or later. There's got to be a point to this. And you almost have that tendency here in the Gospel of Matthew to get through all these names, because they're leading up to something really important. And then if you really read through Matthew 1 over and over again, it will dawn on you that what Matthew is trying to convey through his account is that Christmas is not simply about a birth. It's about a coming. And so he takes us back, way back. What happened in Bethlehem well over 2,000 years ago now. See, it wasn't God's alternative plan because plan A didn't work. It was part of God. It was His original plan. And the Bible tells us that God had planned the coming of the Son, the second person of the Trinity. He had planned His coming all along before we were ever created. This plan was put into place. And so the genealogy teaches us some important truths about the meaning of Christmas and Christianity. We are a privileged people to have this truth right before our eyes, this Word. And here's the first important thing I want to mention this morning. See, the gospel is good news. Not just advice, it's good news. I remember, do you remember the morning you woke up after the election? I couldn't stay up through the whole thing. It was just going way, way past my bedtime. So I went to bed, and the first thing I asked when I woke up, I said, because Carla stayed up, I said, who won? And she said, Trump. I couldn't believe it. I would have bet my entire wealth in Todd Quinton's, and that's a lot of money when you add Todd in there. I would have bet all that Hillary Clinton was going to be our next president. And you know what? When I heard that, that was news. All the previous weeks and months, we had listened to all those newscasts and all those people that were being interviewed and all the pundits. You know what they were giving us? Their opinions and their advice and what they think might happen. It was just advice. But when I heard that Trump won, that was different. That was news. And that news I knew was going to change some things. It wasn't going to be, in our country, business as usual. I mean, we're going to face some changes. Now, I don't know whether they're going to end up good or bad. That's only God knows that. But my point is that it's news. And when Matthew gives us this genealogy, he's giving us news, not advice. I've always loved to tell stories to when my children were little. I'd love to tell them stories, and I really like to tell my grandsons stories. And there's just nothing better to have them in the bed, to get in between them, and it's bedtime, and they don't want to go to bed, but they want to hear a story. And often I begin with once upon a time. You've done that, Now, Bailey, he's still at that age where he'll look at you with those eyes wide open, and he's waiting with expectation. Once upon a time, what, Pops? But Ethan, he's at that age where he knows when I begin once upon a time that it's probably not a true story. It's fairy tale. Now, I'm going to use my imagination. I'm going to make up a lot of things as I go along, and they're going to get, grander and grander. And, he enjoys that, but he knows the real truth. It's imagination. But Matthew doesn't begin this way. He doesn't begin with once upon a time. He begins with this. This is the ancestry of Jesus Christ. Now, what he's doing and why this is important to us is that Matthew is grounding the birth of Christ. He's grounding that event in history. It's not a fairy tale. It's not imagination. This all happened. It's news. That's what I'm trying to tell you this morning. Not advice. This is news. It's going to change everything. And if you ignore it, if you pass over this news and believe it's just mere imagination, that's madness. It's like this. It's like a great king has gathered his army and he's gone out into the field to meet an invading foe. So he takes his army out to meet them, to fight the battle. And then he sends a runner back to the capital city to give updates on how the battle's going. And where I'm getting this is from Old Testament. This was common. There were runners, and they would communicate back to the people how the fight was going. And then here comes this runner, and he's on his way back to the capital city. And they had these watchtowers, and men would be stationed in these watchtowers looking for the runner who's coming back, bringing the news. In fact, Isaiah 52, you can read it. It mentions this. It's a beautiful passage. How beautiful, listen, how beautiful are the feet on the mountains of those who bring good news. Now, anyone want to show us your feet this morning? Not too many. That's not something that we we usually put on Facebook, hey, here's what my feet look like this holiday season. I just got a, what do you call it, pedigree or some pedigree? I've only had one, so. But the point is, it was asked, what the text is telling us, is communicating to us, is it's like these men who are watchmen are trained to watch the way the runner is running. And they knew the difference between a runner who was bringing bad news and a runner who was bringing glorious news. They could tell by the way they ran, by their feet. We had the St. Jude Marathon yesterday. And out of all those thousands of people who ran, there were only a small percentage who really knew what they were doing. The others were just novices, and I know they walked some, and then they ran some, they walked some, they ran some. But there were some who were well-trained, and they ran an entirely different marathon. And that's the point I'm making here. And what these runners were doing was bringing good news. It tells us the story. I bring you glad tidings, Matthew says. Glad tidings of great joy. Joy to the world. And he's saying to us, like the runners might be saying with this news, hey, the king has defeated the enemy, so you can stop building your fortifications. Stop. There's no need. We've won. Stop trying. Stop doing all this unnecessary work. Something it's been done for you, and it changes everything. That's what Matthew's communicating to us in this ancestry. And the biblical accounts of Matthew 1 are really what happened. It's news. So don't go simply looking for morals of the story. This is news. And there's a challenge to us to change the way we live because this has happened. So I would argue with you that there are other religions and even major denominations that we're quite familiar with as Christians. And when they talk about the birth of Christ, they understand it, but they proclaim it as more advice than the news that changes everything. I'm talking about there is this social gospel out there, and they talk about the birth of Christ. Yes, it really happened, but they tend to get off target, off message, and they move to, salvation is something that we have to wrestle with and struggle for, and everybody comes by it in their own way, so you have to perform, and it comes if you pray, and if you obey, and if you attend church and transform your consciousness, and you pay your tithes and offering. They're getting off message. The gospel, the news of the gospel says that all of that has been done in Jesus Christ. The founder of Christianity comes to us and says, I am the truth. I am spiritual reality. And you can never measure up to me. You could never come to the Father. So I've come to save you. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. That's our good news. At Advent, it's just the beginning of the story of the life of Christ on this earth. And you know the story. And it will, all the way, from weeks from now, we'll begin to celebrate and remember what? The final days of Christ. And we'll gather on a Thursday night, and we'll begin to commemorate what Jesus did in the great humiliation as the king comes as a sheep and he dies. There's a whole story. Jesus, he will cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He goes into this dark place because the Father turns his back on him. And if you think about the manger scene, the night Jesus was born, it's almost a prophetic scene, because here is the Son of God, and he has no ability to take advantage of all the modern comforts of his day. He's born out in a cold, damp, dark stable. Darkness. Prophetic of the end of his life, when he will go to the cross and the Father will turn his back on him because he has taken upon himself all the sin of the world. So Christianity, guys, it's not simply a message about self-improvement. It's not just a place to get some inspiration and guidance in your life. It's first of all a message that you need to be saved, and salvation is something you could never merit. So you have to ask the right questions. Did God really become a human being? Did Jesus really live a life on this earth, some 33 odd years, and die for us on a cross? And did he really rise from the dead? And if these claims are true, then everything else in this Bible makes sense to us, and everything else in this Bible is true. It's not just good advice. It changes everything. And that brings me to the second point. The gospel story, believe it or not, changes how we read other stories. For us, it's a mental and spiritual paradigm shift. See, it's not fiction, and yet I would argue that it changes the way we read fiction. Think of the great fairy tales that maybe you heard when you were a child, or maybe you tell them now to your children. Disney produces some of these and puts them on the big screen. Beauty and the Beast, and Sleeping Beauty, and King Arthur. You remember those stories. They didn't really happen. They're not taught to be factual. And yet, even as adults, when we watch these things or we read these stories, it seems to ignite something down in us. Not only imagination, but it seems to ignite longings of the heart. And I say that it does because deep in the human heart, there are desires that God has placed in our hearts. There are things there that just the natural world can't scratch that itch. For example, to experience the supernatural. There is something inside of us that tells us there's something beyond what we can see and touch and feel and taste. That even in the confines of this room, the supernatural exists. Do you believe there are angels even right now in our midst? I do. Even though we can't touch them like we can that chair, they are nonetheless real. And that's in our hearts. God's put it there. The supernatural. And then this thing about death. You got it in your heart. There's got to be something beyond this. It's got to be true. I will live again. I'm not going to just live 70 and it's all over. God has put something down in our heart that tells us. And I say one of the things that you need to recognize is, guys, I believe that the reason we fear death is because it's not natural. I know most people end up dying and we have their memorial services, but it's still not natural, and I think that's a God thing. God tells us when we go to the service of a loved one or a friend or a church member, this is not supposed to be. And then the imaginations of the heart begin to flutter and jump, and we begin to think, oh, it's true. One day we will live again. God has put those things in our heart. And I'm just saying to you, because the gospel is news, It changes the way we read fiction. We find fantasy stories incredibly moving and satisfying. Why? Because well-told stories, momentarily at least, satisfy these desires I've talked about. They scratch that inner itch we have, that we will live forever in a perfect place. A place with no winter. A place with no pain. No anxiety. No cancer. No kidney stones. Lord, I long for that day. I passed one Friday. No more of that. No more saying goodbye to people. No more dysfunctional families. And you know what? Most of all, we will see Jesus. When I was a child, young boy, I remember praying at night, oh God, if I could just see you. If I could just see you, I know I would believe. And as I grew older, and the scriptures were taught to me, I began to understand, I will see God. We will. Jesus is God. And right now, He is in a physical body. He will never leave that physical body. And we, best of all, we will be with God. And that's the safest, best place to be on the earth. By the way, my little problem with kidney stones pales in comparison with how people suffer in this world. All that will be over. Well, let me say it another way. Even though the fairy tales aren't factually true, the truth of the incarnation means neither are these stories simply escapism. They do have some benefit. Because the gospel is true. All the best stories will be proved, in the ultimate sense, true. We come to the Christmas story, and at first glance, it's like other legends. Here's a story about someone from a different place, a different world, and he comes and he breaks into our world, and then he has these miraculous powers. He goes around healing people. He can calm storms, and he even raises people from the dead. Then his enemies turn on him. His own people turn on him. And they put him to death. And it seems like that hope is over. But ultimately, he rises from the dead and saves anyone who will humble themselves before him. Matthew's gospel refutes any of these fairy tale notions. This can't be another great fairy tale. It's not a once upon a time. Jesus is the underlying reality to which all the other stories are really about and point to. Thirdly, the gospel turns the world's values upside down. I told you there's a paradigm shift in the way we live. See, what's Matthew saying? To see this, we have to know something about the culture in which Matthew was writing. And this gospel was probably written late in the first century. Sometimes we think the Gospels were written first because they're in the first part of the New Testament. But in reality, the four Gospels were probably written late. And what was the culture like in those days? Well, I can tell you this. A lot different than ours. And I'm not talking about technology. We live in an individualistic culture. For example, when we go to try to find a new job, what do we put together? A resume. And what's in the resume? All the best things we can think of about ourselves. I mean, we put down our education levels, and we include our job experience, and we include exceptional things that maybe we've done, or things we've solved, or and our interest, or maybe our hobbies. Today, when we try to get to know someone, one of the first questions we ask is, what? What do you do? Because in our culture, what we do defines us to a large degree, doesn't it? But it wasn't that way in Matthew's day. Their culture was a communal, family-oriented society. And in Matthew's time, their ancestry was their resume, if you will. And so if they went out to looking for new work, they would present their resume, their ancestry. And the master would come to them and say, look, I want to know your family history. I want to know your pedigree. That's where I got confused earlier. I want to know your pedigree. I want to know what clan you're from. They wouldn't ask, what do you do? They would ask, who are you? That was their culture, communal. It was a communal culture. And so Matthew is saying in this genealogy, it's his way of saying to the world, this is who Jesus is. This is where he came. Now look, it's interesting that even in Matthew's days, they would tweak their ancestry. Because you know, everybody has some bad apples. My cousin a few years ago did an ancestry for my mother's side of the family and had these things printed up and sent to all the cousins, and I've got one, and I was just staggered. And I've told you about this. You know, my 14th great-grandfather is the same 14th great-grandfather as Princess Diana, and his name was Sir Richard Yates. Or no, Lord Richard Yates. And man, well, that's a good pedigree. But you know what? When you get closer and closer and closer to my generation, some things I wouldn't want you to see. You're talking about dirt poor. I mean poor. But that's not too bad. You know, some of us, we don't want to tell people, I was raised in... And they would do that in Matthew's time. They would leave out some things they wouldn't want people to know about, their ancestry. And here's the amazing thing. Matthew doesn't do that. To begin with, he lists at least 5 women in the ancestry, and that was unheard of, to even list women in your ancestry. And he lists 5. And you know what? They're all the mothers of Jesus. Also, the women in Jesus' ancestry were Gentiles. Most of them. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth. Tamar and Rahab were Canaanites, and Ruth was a Moabitess. And if you've read anything about the Canaanites and the Moabites, you know how God felt about them and Israel's contact with those people. They were not to associate with those people because they were unholy. To the Jews, these nations were unclean. We would call them today racial outsiders. They don't have their green card. And yet they're right here in his ancestry. Matthew doesn't skim over them or skip them. And there's another really surprising dimension. Listen to this. By naming these particular women, he's deliberately calling the reader to some of the most sordid, nasty, immoral incidents in the Bible. Because when you bring these names up and you go back to their stories, it's ugly. You remember, like for example in verse 3, Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Remember that story? Tamar tricked her father-in-law Judah into having sex with her. That was incest. Clearly a violation of God's holy law. And Matthew includes Perez and Zerah, both Judah and Tamar, to make sure we bring the whole story together. He doesn't want us to miss any of it. And it was out of that dysfunctional family that Jesus was born. And we can't forget Rahab in verse 5. She was not just a Canaanite, she was a prostitute. Look in verse 6. And Jesse begot David. I found this so interesting as I read through this chapter. Did you pick up on this? Verse 6. And Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her, who had been the wife of Uriah. Now, my question is, why not name her? Why did he leave her name out? Do you know who the wife of Uriah was? Yeah, everybody knows her name. But why did Matthew leave her name off the list? I think it's a challenge. I think he's wanting us to think back to their ancient history and to remember her name. And when we remember her name, we pick up the sordid details that surround the whole scandal. And it was a horrible scandal. Go back. Remember David in his young years when he was a servant to King Saul, and then King Saul turned on David, and David had to run and hide in the caves. You remember that part of his life? And there were a few men who banded around David. They were like their version of our SEAL Team 6. These were really great men of war. And they were willing to take an arrow for David. And they protected him as David would hide from place to place. And you know what? One of those men, you know who his name was? Uriah. Willing to take an arrow for David. And David would turn and do what he did. In essence, murder Uriah so he could have his wife, Bathsheba. And she would give birth to Solomon. Amazing. And so we see this full list, and they're full of moral failures, adulterers and adulteresses, and incestuous relationships, and prostitutes. And we're reminded that even the male ancestors, David, the great king, were moral failures. And they all are acknowledged publicly as the ancestors of Jesus. Now, what's this mean? What does it mean for us? Some good things. First of all, it means that anyone can be in the family. Anyone. Unholiness was considered to be contagious in ancient times, like the leper. The leper was sort of a symbol of that. The leper, when he was walking down the city streets, he would have to, it was by law, he would have to announce his coming. And he would say, unclean, unclean. Just in case somebody was coming around a corner and they didn't see him, he had to announce himself so they wouldn't catch his disease. Unholiness was considered contagious. And Jesus comes into the world and he turns that whole thing around. He comes to the earth and he lives in the leper colony, the leper's colony. He lives among all the unholy people. And yet, he doesn't catch our unholiness. By knowing him, we become contaminated, if you will, with his righteousness. Anyone can be in the family. This is great news. Secondly, everyone needs the grace of God. Think about the worst person you know, or the worst person you've read about. Or think about the best person you've ever known in your life. And they equally need the grace of God. When I was a child and growing up, we always studied the old King James Version. There was a time when we thought that was the only really inspired version of the Bible. You know, it had to be the old King James Version, and it had the old words in there, the begats, the begats, the begats, the begats, and on and on and on it would go, and the these and the thous. You know, if you've ever read the old King James Version, and on it goes. But I think back, so the grace of God is so pervasive that even all the begats of the Bible are dripping with the mercy of God. Grace of God is so pervasive that even the begats of the Bible, the ones we want to leave out that shouldn't be there, can be included. Thirdly, it means, and listen to this, guys, go home with this today. God is not ashamed of you. He's not ashamed to announce that you are His. Let me make it more personal. The Bible tells us that we are brothers with Christ. And Christ is not ashamed to say, Tommy Downs is my brother. Richard Hall is my brother. That's good news. Hebrews 2:11, He is not ashamed to call you brother. That's the gospel. And that's news. Good news. Hey, we're going to close this morning with a song. I'm going to get the band to come up here. The worship team. I like, when we can and we have the time, I like to close with singing. I think it's good for us. Can you celebrate the good news this morning? The good news of the gospel. We're all in the family. We all belong. Well, our names are listed there. They always will be. Stand with me this morning. See, that's the good news that we need to proclaim. People need to hear the good news. It brings the only true joy in life and in this world. Let's close as we sing together. To the world the Lord is come. Let earth receive her kings. Let every heart prepare Him room. Heaven nature sing, and heaven nature sing, and heaven nature sing. He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the glories of His righteousness, and wonders of His love, and wonders of His love, and wonders of His love. Now, don't you forget, if you need some special prayer with us, don't leave today. That's our commitment to you. We'd love to spend some personal, private time with you today. In the meantime, as you leave today, receive these words of blessings. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.